The female chimpanzee at the Philadelphia Zoological Garden died of complications from a cold on December 27th in the morning, 1878. According to the news report, Miss Chimpanzee died while receiving the attentions of her companion. Both she and that companion, a 4-year-old male, had been born and then captured in West Africa in April of that same year. In the wild, the chimpanzees live together in small bands of a half a dozen, and they sleep on platforms that they've built among the branches out of the boughs and leaves. But in Philadelphia, in the monkey house, where it was just the two of them, they had become accustomed to sleep at night in each other's arms, on a blanket on the floor, clutching each other desperately, achingly throughout the long, cold nights. Mr. and Miss Chimpanzee were 2 of only 4 chimpanzees in America, and when she died, human observers mourned her loss. But above all, they remarked on the behavior of her companion. For a long time, he tried in vain to rouse her. Then he went into a frenzy of grief. The bereaved chimpanzee began to pull out the hair from his head. He wailed, making a sound the zookeeper had never heard before. His cries were heard over the entire garden. He dashed himself against the bars of the cage and upon the hardwood floors. And when this burst of grief was over, he poked his head under the straw in one corner and moaned as if his heart would break. Nothing quite like this had ever been recorded. Even long after the death of the female, the male invariably slept on a crossbeam at the top of the cage, returning to inherited habit and showing probably that the apprehension of unseen dangers had been heightened by his sense of loneliness. Loneliness is grief distended. People are primates and even more sociable than chimpanzees. We hunger for intimacy. We wither without it. And yet, long before the present pandemic, with its forced isolation and social distancing, humans have begun building their own monkey houses. Before modern times, very few humans lived alone. Beginning not much more than a century ago, that slowly changed. In the United States, more than 1 in 4 people now live alone. In some parts of the country, especially big cities, that percentage is much higher. You can live alone, of course, without being lonely. And you can be lonely without living alone. But the two are closely tied together, which makes lockdowns and sheltering in place that much harder to bear. Plenty of people like to be alone. I myself love to be alone, but solitude and seclusion are different from loneliness. Loneliness is a state of profound distress. Loneliness, it seems unnecessary to say, is terrible for your health. The good news for us is that God designed us for relationships. I have never heard anyone say that they wish for fewer, less meaningful relationships. Each one of us longs to be more deeply connected with friends, and this is because God made us for friendship. From the very beginning, when God created the world, God pronounced that everything was good. But then once he created Adam, there's a statement that we read in the Bible that startles us. Something is not good. In Genesis 2:18, we read, "It is not good that man should be alone." Adam was not yet complete. He needed community. He needed a friend. He needed a loyal friend. It reminds me of the 2 men who were hiking in the woods when they saw a bear, and the one man took off his pack, pulled out his running shoes, and started putting them on. And his friend frantically said, "Man, what are you doing? You can't outrun that bear." And the man said, "I don't need to outrun that bear. I only need to outrun you." Well, we need a more loyal friend than that, or at least someone who is willing to try. A number of years ago, I read the book The Same Kind of Different as Me, and I recently watched the movie with Greg Kinnear and Renee Zellweger. The book is much better, but I enjoyed this true story about a wealthy Dallas couple, Ron and Debbie Hall, who volunteered at a homeless shelter. Debbie poured her life and soul into the people that she met there. Debbie encouraged, or maybe even badgered, her husband Ron to befriend a volatile black homeless man named Denver who had been incarcerated for 30 years. They were two hard-hearted men who were polar opposites. The only thing they seemed to have in common was their love of Debbie. Well, after several weeks of showing up to help at the shelter, Ron finally got Denver to agree to go to breakfast with him. Ron found Denver's story fascinating, though tragic. Denver's wisdom was beyond belief, though he was totally illiterate. Eventually, Denver became Ron's professor in life, and Ron was his very willing student. But on this morning, when Ron asked Denver if he would be his friend, Denver was concerned because he had heard that when white people went fishing, they did something called catch and release. And this bothered him because his community always showed each other what they had caught, and then they ate what they caught. He couldn't understand why white folks would go to all the trouble to catch a fish, and when they caught it, just throw it back in the water. So Denver said to Mr. Ron, "If you're fishing for a friend that you're just going to catch and release, then I have no desire to be your friend." Suddenly, Denver's eyes gentled, and he spoke more softly than ever before. And he said, "But if you are looking for a real friend, then I'll be your friend forever." For all the attention we pay to eros or romantic love stories, some of the most compelling tales, both fiction and not, are those of loyal friends like Thelma and Louise, Woody and Buzz Lightyear, Captain Kirk and Spock, not Spot the dog, Spock, Harry, Ron and Hermione, David and Jonathan. No matter what, these friends had each other's backs through thick and thin, despite all the many bumps that they encountered along the way. Well, over 2 millennia ago, the great first-century Roman philosopher Seneca said, "Ponder for a long time whether you shall admit a given person to your friendship. But when you have decided to admit him, welcome him with all your heart and soul." This thought captures the relationship between David and Jonathan. But you know, one of the most famous friendships of the Bible almost didn't happen. David and Jonathan were supposed to be enemies. Jonathan was the son of King Saul, the very monarch that David the shepherd boy was appointed by God to replace. King Saul wanted to kill David, but Jonathan befriended him and risked his own life to warn David of his father's plans. From the moment Jonathan and David actually met, an immediate bond was forged between them. The Revised Standard Version says the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Jonathan would be David's #1 advocate and friend. And out of this deep phileo friendship love, Jonathan formalized his covenant with David by giving him his own royal robe and his weapons, armor, sword, bow, and belt. And this action seemed to transfer David's right to claim the throne. But true friendship requires mutuality. Psychologist Dr. Suzanne Deggs-White says, true friendships are hallmarked by each member's desire to engage with the other. It's about mutual interest in one another's experiences and thoughts, as well as a sense of belongingness and connection. Friendships require reciprocity of admiration, respect, trust, and emotional support. Do you remember the theme song from Toy Story by Randy Newman called "You've Got a Friend in Me"? One verse says, "You've got a friend in me. You got troubles and I got 'em too. There isn't anything I wouldn't do for you. We stick together. We see it through, 'cause you got a friend in me." Well, that kind of friendship, loyalty, and mutuality in our brokenness is what I remember of the friends George and Lenny in that classic book by John Steinbeck, Of Mice and Men. He tells the story of George Milton and Lenny Small, two displaced migrant farm workers who moved from place to place in California in search of new job opportunities during the Great Depression. Lenny Small is a large man with a mild mental disability. He is deeply devoted to George and dependent upon him for protection and guidance. However, their friendship and devotion is mutual as they share a dream of one day owning their own farm together. At one point, George defends his relationship with Lenny when he says, "I ain't got no people. I seen the guys that go around on the ranches alone. That ain't no good. They don't have no fun. After a long time, they get mean. They get wanting to fight all the time. Of course, Lenny's a darn nuisance most of the time, but you get used to going around with a guy and you just can't get rid of him." I hear that same kind of loyalty and mutuality in our brokenness through the exchange between Jesus and Peter. Peter had most recently denied Jesus 3 times and seemed ill fit to be a disciple, let alone the rock which Jesus is going to build the church upon. But as Peter is declaring his love for Jesus 3 times, Jesus gives Peter, the guy who has troubles just like everyone else, that important assignment to feed and care for all of God's children. And most importantly, all of this has to be done through the lens of relationship, through phileo love. Jesus himself embodies phileo love. In Matthew 11:19, Jesus was described as a friend to sinners. When Jesus called the disciples his friends, philia was the word he used. Friendship is so important to God, and God knows it's important to us. I'd like you to listen to this poem called "Staying Home" by Rosemary Traumer. She beautifully weaves together the fear of isolation with the power of friendship. And when fear comes to the door bringing flowers, acting as if it's a friend, it's okay to not want to let it in. It's okay to lock the door. It'll make you feel as if you're doing something. Fear will enter anyway. At least it won't expect a hug. It won't wash its hands, not even when you ask nicely. And it is more contagious than any virus, spreads without sneezes or coughs. It won't leave when you ask, but there are ways to make it quieter, like inviting a few others to join you, preferably gratitude, compassion, love, kindness, vulnerability. These friends always come when asked, wearing the loveliest perfume. They change the conversation the way lemon and honey change the bitter tea. They remind you who you are, invite you to look out the window and see how beautiful the world when the shadows are long. Friendship brings us the gifts of gratitude, compassion, love, kindness, and vulnerability. Friends remind us of who we are and whose we are. The value of friendship is unmeasurable, both given and received. Sally Bernethi wrote a story about her best friend, Paula, whom she met in first grade. She writes, "When we were 10 years old, we saw an episode of Lassie in which Timmy and his friend pricked their fingers and became blood brothers. Paula came home with me the next evening. We dug a hole in the hard earth out behind my family's weathered old barn, took a thorn from the locust tree and pricked our thumbs, joining our blood. We buried the thorn, each adding an item we prized as the friends on Lassie had done. Paula contributed her dime store set of watercolors, and I added a paperback book. Our most valuable possessions, but not as valuable as our friendship." C.S. Lewis wrote, "Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art, like the universe itself. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which gives value to survival." Well, as it turns out, King David valued Jonathan's relationship and friendship very much, and he was loyal even to the next generation. After Saul and his sons were killed in battle, David intoned a lamentation over Saul and his son Jonathan called the Song of the Bow. All of the Israelites were required to memorize it. In one stanza from 2 Samuel 1:26, David wrote, "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women." In 2 Samuel 9:1, King David says, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Saul's servant Ziba said, "There remains a son of Jonathan named Mephibosheth, who is crippled in his feet." When David was united with Mephibosheth, David said, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." God gave us the power of friendship to mitigate loneliness and to truly care for one another. Every friendship is a small and imperfect echo of the triune God who made us in his image, not to catch and release, but to be a real friend forever.